Thank you for having me here
Absolutely.
today.
Well, thank you. And so we've heard a lot already this morning, and you see on the screen about this new blueprint for business, as if business is fundamentally changing. What does that mean to you? What do you see as the role for business going forward, and how does that unique role set you up for that new blueprint?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a theme of you heard from the last two speakers. It's how does business change its own mindset to thinking about how do you run a business for the next quarter century versus for the next quarter. And that really is a shift. And what I've seen is that even the financial industry is starting to wake up and understand that, because I remember in 2011 when I was appointed to be the Chief Sustainability Officer, I thought I'd come out of the business. So I said, great, the first thing we need to do is have a conversation with the investors, make sure they see the value in this. And it was nice, they listened the first year, but they didn't ask a lot of questions on the earnings calls. Today, fast forward several years later, the questions are changing, and I give a lot of credit to Larry Fink, who wrote the open letter to the CEOs, or to Bill McNabb from Vanguard, who really started to push that agenda and said, well, even though BlackRock came out with that letter first, we're going to keep this going. The questions are starting to be asked by the analyst, and that's what's going to fundamentally change a business. And so CEOs today have to think about the long term while they're still driving the short-term success.
And so your role talks about both core business from a marketing perspective, but then you're also focused on public affairs. And I think there's a lot of debate around what role business should play and perhaps what role business should not play. Yes. And how do you interact with the public sector in different ways? So can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I'll tell my dirty little secret here, which is when our CEO asked me to take over public affairs, I had a horrible impression. They need a new branding effort for anyone titled PR. Because I thought, I don't want to be the PR person. I'm a business person, I'm a marketer, I'm a sustainability chief. PR people, in my view, had a negative perception in terms of, well, they get paid to make the company look good, and sometimes that means stretching the truth. So I rejected that immediately and said, I'm not really interested in that job. We got into a little bit of a dialogue around this, and I had to change my mental model, which was, well, actually, if you have people coming out of different sectors into these roles and reframing that PR needs to be about transparency and telling the truth. It's the truth seekers who have to then say what the business isn't doing well, and then how do you actually fix those things, and putting that journey in place. How do you actually start to get others involved in the journey and use that voice of the company to make it a wider discussion? And so it was interesting because I do believe that today companies and brands have to take a voice, because really companies are a collection of people who work in your business. We're not, robots. We're human beings. And if we want our planet to be here for our children in the next generation, and I care deeply about my own 2 children, right? I want them to actually go to work every day and have a difference being made in their lives, and for our planet to still be here for them, where they can breathe clean air. They know that they can actually go out and enjoy the parks and the playgrounds, that there's this quality of life for humanity that exists because companies use their voice to make it better, not to just simply sustain. I also hate the word sustainability, so we need to rebrand that as well.
We do need a new word for that. So
who wants to simply sustain? No one wants to sustain. We all want to grow and we want to thrive.
Excellent. And so certainly you've got a large employee base, and so that representation of humanity is really interesting from an employee perspective. But you also are leaders at engaging consumers and speaking to the humanity of consumers. I think a lot of us in the room really struggle with how do you reach consumers in a way that they don't just say, oh, that's good, but it influences behavior. It influences consumer choice. So talk a little bit about how sustainability, or whatever the new word is, fits into that kind of consumer engagement.
Well, consumers talk to brands. Brands have to listen more. And so I think sometimes, and today the beauty of digital technology is you can hear them, their voices are louder. They come to you versus snail mail through putting a letter in the mail to a CEO. I think back to what's changed. So back in the 80s, we had this phenomenon around New Coke. We changed our formula. We had no idea, and think about that, that's before the digital era. We had no idea that in 90 days we'd be reintroducing back the original Coke formula, because consumers deeply cared about the brand and they owned it. We didn't own it. And that was the moment Coke first realized we don't actually own our brands. People own our brands. And so how do you listen to people through this journey as a company? And today you have social listening tools. People are not afraid to send you tweets into the public and tell the world how they feel. And so for sustainability, it's caring deeply about what are the values of the people who work in your business, the people who are purchasing your brands, the people who are invested in you, and how do you invest back in them and in society and the things they care about. Now, you can't be everything to all people. You have to stand for something. And so it goes to the point of, I was frustrated when I first came into the sustainability role because I knew we had done a lot. Coke didn't just wake up because we had a chief sustainability officer and get involved in helping out communities. It was core to our DNA. We were the first corporation to have a woman appointed to our corporate board of directors in 1934. How many people knew it? Zero. I mean, it's important, the story to be told. We're the first partner with the Red Cross, bringing water and disaster relief efforts in place in 1917. We're the first to do life cycle analysis. So none of those stories were told, and when I did the research around it, I was shocked that less than 12% of global 32 markets globally actually knew what we were doing. And then when we looked at the employee base, the numbers were actually even worse. And so it was interesting because I think what has happened is there wasn't a mechanism in the past to actually listen very closely, but also then share back the stories. Now we have all these great mechanisms through technology to listen more, to then understand what are the issues that you can own as a business, and then put your voice behind it and make sure that you're doing all the right things. And if you're not perfect, admit it, and then put some things in place to get better at it. And what I mean by that is we all know the friends. How many people have friends here who are so busy that every time you call them, you make plans, but they cancel on you every single time, and you have no idea what they're actually doing? I see some heads nodding, right? And you're like, wow, they're a great friend, but I have no idea what they do. Companies and brands can get caught up in that. You could do so many things that you don't stand for anything, or you could do a few things and not tell your story, then people have no idea. So it's finding that balance in terms of not being afraid to tell the story when you have a story to tell, even if the story is not perfect, but also really listening to understand you're playing in the space that you have credibility to play in.
That's excellent. And I think one of the questions that we'll be talking about throughout the conference really is now you have all this information, right? So we can listen. How do you know who to listen to? And how do you know when do you just stand up for because of who you are versus being in that responsive role?
And that's a reconciliation of your values. And so let me get to why we chose water, women, and think about World Without Waste for Coca-Cola. There's a lot of other great things we could be doing, and we had been doing a lot of other great things. But you look at a beverage business, you don't exist without water. Society doesn't exist without water. There's a mutual dependency there. There's actually a mutual opportunity. Think about women's economic empowerment. I get asked this question a lot. Why is Coke doing that? 70% of our purchasers are women. Guess what? And when women actually are empowered in society, the UN studies say 90 cents of their dollar that they earn goes back to help society become better. There's a shared opportunity to invest in women, and it's really important because they matter to society and to brands. And then World Without Waste. You cannot have a beverage without water. You cannot have a beverage without delivering in some sort of vehicle. Packaging. We know that this world has a plastic pollution problem. We know that. This has been something that I know Aaron had me here years ago. I have a deep personal passion for recycling and for packaging because we have to solve this packaging waste problem. And years ago, we created a program linked to the fashion industry. We said, well, let's take the PET bottles we have, let's recycle them into something really cool. Created this brand called EcoCycle. It was a business too, not just a brand, it was a social enterprise. We said 100% of profit will go back to recycling initiatives. We partnered with will.i.am, a celebrity, to give pop culture into this and say, well, it'll get attention. If it's just Coke, might not get as much attention. And then we partnered with brands, with Adidas to create uniforms made out of recycled PET, or Turn, which is a European bicycle company, to do the folding bikes made out of PET. And it really was an amazing thing. We were here 5 years ago. What I'd say is that probably infrastructure wasn't in place. We had trouble getting material. We had all sorts of issues sort of making this company and business thrive. But for the brands who actually decided that this new model of changing their supply chains to be a part of EcoCycle was better for them, those brands took off. And at the same time, it gave us some critical learning to start to build the infrastructure and the pieces we needed for World Without Waste in order to recognize that, well, before you can create brands made out of recycled PET, you need to collect the recycled PET. And maybe over time, there's other materials that you need to think about in terms of delivering your beverages in, because you need to eliminate single-use plastics. They have to go away. Or how will we solve these other problems? And so it's also what I would say in a long-winded way is knowing what your business can do and knowing the right time in which it can do those things in. But also when you hit the speed bumps, you have to go over them. So if we had given up on plastic pollution because EcoCycle wasn't this huge global brand and business we thought it would be to collect all the material, we wouldn't have World Without Waste. We looked at it and we said, what worked, what didn't work, how can we make this better? And let's shelve it for now. Maybe the time for that is later on, but let's go ahead and do World Without Waste and get infrastructure in place, partner with governments, partner with NGOs, and start investing in R&D in terms of new material.
I really appreciate you bringing up that example, because I think too often, especially when you're on a stage, we try to talk about all of our accomplishments, and actually a lot of the times what we need to talk about is things that didn't work as well, and to talk about that root cause as to why, so that we can actually solve it and figure out where those gaps are. And so I think it's a really helpful example. You also touched on within that you tend to take an approach that is very much a partnership-based approach. And I think for as long as I've worked with your company, you've always sort of been at that center in terms of really trying to convene partners, stakeholders, and not taking a go-it-alone approach. How does that work, especially as you're also trying to market and you're also trying to differentiate your brand? How do you balance those two? And maybe that's not a tension, and I just need to learn more about marketing. But.
Well, I think it's sometimes we have to get over our own personal selves. And I know I had to do it when I became the Chief Sustainability Officer, because I used to look at my competitors before as competitors, right, not partners. And so this was new, because I'd be competing with the best Olympics program, the best whatever program in the marketplace. And then here I found myself sitting down at a table with Pepsi, Danone, Unilever, all of the folks that would be traditional competitors, talking about how do we make sure that water is protected for society and also for business, and how do we think about that, and what else could we do? What more could we do to accelerate our work and do it together? That I had to get over walking in the room, because as a marketer, I was trained to, no, those are the bad people. Well, I realized, no, we're the bad people if we can't partner with them on things that are important to the world. So what I liked is that there were people before me. Some people might have heard the name Jeff Seabright, and before Jeff Seabright, there were others. But they were the ones who built the partnerships in terms of the Water Resources Group to get the competition all together in a room with then other NGOs. Aaron had a seat firsthand at some of these tables in terms of how do we actually work together in terms of industry, and then how do we look at non-traditional partnerships, and how do we think about NGOs in terms of helping us to see the places where we're not seeing, to help us look around the corner, to be the implementation partners, to put the tension into our business. I like the tension. Some people think I'm crazy, but I think it makes us better. I mean, I like sports, and I think about sports. How fun would a Super Bowl be if there were two teams that were on the same side? You wouldn't have a Super Bowl, right? And so, but they still walk out of there as friends. It's not, they're still winning in terms of their sport, but there's that natural tension to make the winners win stronger, and to take the folks who need to improve and make them think about how they can run better plays to get smarter at the game. And so I like the natural tension of what NGOs do to corporate America, and I like society, because it's people. It's our friends, it's our family who keep us honest every single day. And I'll never forget the story of when I first got into Chief Sustainability, and my son looked at me and he was holding our plant bottle in Dasani, and he asked me an important question. He said, well, he first challenged me on one thing. He said, Mom, we don't recycle upstairs. Why don't we recycle upstairs? Shampoo bottles need to be recycled. And I said, oh my gosh, good point. You're right. His second question is, why does this only say 30% plant bottle? Why isn't it 100? You're Coke, Mom. And that was my own child, right? So I guarantee that's the same voice as almost every single person out there who's looking at companies and brands and saying, if you're a luxury brand, and it was said earlier, you have an accountability as a leader to role model. How do you role model? How do you step ahead? How do you get to the 100% versus staying at 30?
I love the sort of healthy tension idea, and perhaps building on that and getting to some of the not so healthy tension. You heard a little bit about the scenarios that we announced last night. And it's okay, you didn't have to read them either. But
I read a few of them.
Excellent. So one of them was called Tribalism, Inc. And it talks about the fact that there's a future in which political polarization has entered the world of business, and where all brands, accurately or not, are seen as being affiliated on one side or the other. And I read that scenario, and I knew I was going to be interviewing you, so I pictured the Coke song and everybody holding hands and sharing a Coke, and it's the opposite of this tribalism. How do you navigate the growing demands from consumers to pick a side, and to pick a side, especially when your brand is intended to focus on that kind of unity?
Well, I'll say a few things. One is, I kind of got a little smile on tribalism because coming out of the marketing world, there's, over a decade ago, there was a book written by Seth Godin around tribes and talking about like-minded people and how your own associates and consumers are shifting to having like-minded causes, and maybe a 21-year-old is more similar to a 70-year-old versus 21-year-old to 21-year-old. And so consumer marketers used to segment people by demographics. Well, actually, segmenting people by like-mindedness or mindsets is actually more powerful because then you understand what issues are important to the world. But also, at the same time, companies can no longer expect leaders or for people to just listen to leaders. People are going to challenge, and their voices want to be heard, and that's good, and that's part of tribalism. So it's interesting because as a marketer, I've been seeing and reading tribalism for years. As a Coca-Cola associate, what I can say is what I like is that Coke's never been afraid to step into things. And so you brought up the Hilltop spot. That was done in, my goodness, probably the 60s. And that was about bringing the world together when there was some divisiveness. I mean, history does repeat itself. And back then there was a lot of divisiveness and fear. And so Coke said, we're going to step right into this. And the real people in the commercial were brought from all around the world to show that people can come together if they find something in common. Now for us, it was, a Coke is relevant for everyone, whether you're 80 years old, 21 years old. It was a simple beverage that people could enjoy together. Fast forward to the Mean Joe Green spot we did. When you had the young boy throwing the jersey to Mean Joe Green, this big guy who's supposed to be mean as his title, that brought people together. And then fast forward again to, I should go backwards a little bit. Martin Luther King, when he won the Nobel Prize, do you know that the city of Atlanta at first refused to actually host a dinner in his honor? And you know what the Coke CEO did at the time, and this is long before my time? He said, we'll move our headquarters in. If the city of Atlanta will not support Martin Luther King and hold him a party, then we'll move our headquarters. So I'm really proud to work for a company that didn't just wake up today because people are starting to express a voice now a little bit louder. It's always expressed its own voice based on its value system, and it's never wavered from that. And for me, that tells me that our DNA of our company and our culture is stronger than one individual who's run it. I give a lot of credit to the founding fathers who set that culture from day one. But it's really important for companies to understand what are their values and what are they going to stand up for, and then have the debates and have the conversations when people want to argue with you. There's nothing wrong with healthy debate, right? That's what makes it all better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I wish we had more time.
No,
but that was
absolutely.
really great.
Appreciate it. Thank you.